Hello and welcome to CyberByteFM, your ultimate source for cybersecurity, privacy, compliance, AI, and threat intelligence. Get expert insights, breaking news, and practical tips to stay one byte ahead in the digital world. Unlock the code to safer systems, decode the threats shaping tomorrow. Hit subscribe and join the frequency.
Right, and we have a lot of ground to cover today.
We absolutely do. So we are initiating an executive briefing on the Q1 2026 Global Data Breach Retrospective. If you are reporting to the board this quarter, you need to know that the threat landscape has demonstrably shifted.
Significantly.
Yeah, the telemetry we're seeing requires immediate strategic realignment. And look, the single most critical data point you really must understand, just to set the baseline for this quarter, is this. Over 1 billion highly sensitive Know Your Customer identity records were left completely unauthenticated on the public internet by IDMerit in Q1 2026.
And just to contextualize that scale, this wasn't just a localized leak. This single MongoDB cluster exposed comprehensive identity portfolios spanning at least 26 countries. Yes, it sets a definitive, irrefutable baseline for the severity and really the sheer volume of our current global threat environment.
Exactly. So our mission today is to analyze this retrospective to extract, strategic threat vectors for C-suite and board-level consumption. We are going to bypass the technical minutia and focus strictly on material risk.
Just the facts and the underlying mechanisms of these exposures.
Right. So we begin with the highest volume, lowest effort vector currently active across enterprise environments, and that is cloud infrastructure misconfigurations.
Yes, which is highly prevalent right now.
It is. And before we allocate resources to defend against complex cyber syndicates or advanced persistent threats, boards must understand that catastrophic organizational losses are currently stemming from simple administrative failures.
Precisely.
The IDMerit breach is really the prime indicator of this systemic issue. I mean, we must ask ourselves if we are over-indexing our security budgets on advanced perimeter defenses when basic cloud hygiene is failing so spectacularly.
The clinical facts of the IDMerit case substantiate that assessment entirely. Discovered in November 2025 by researchers at Cybernews, the exposed environment was an active production MongoDB instance.
An active production instance. That is just, well, go on.
Out of a roughly 3 billion record cluster, approximately 1 billion records represented highly sensitive personal data. This was compiled specifically for Know Your Customer or KYC purposes.
Okay, and just to be absolutely clear for everyone listening, a cloud misconfiguration is a failure to properly implement security settings, leaving internal network systems accessible via the public internet.
Exactly. When we talk about a cloud misconfiguration here, we aren't talking about a sophisticated hack. We are talking about a failure to properly configure access, meaning someone literally left internal network systems accessible to anyone with a web browser.
Which means the threat actor did not need to deploy sophisticated malware. They didn't need to engineer a complex phishing campaign or exploit a zero-day vulnerability.
No, they didn't.
They simply utilize automated scanning tools that constantly map the entire IPv4 address space, located the server address, and access the data without a single prompt for authentication.
Right.
It is literally the equivalent of building a heavily guarded, multi-million-dollar corporate fortress, but then just leaving the master blueprints sitting on a park bench down the street.
So what specific data categories are we looking at in this exposed cluster?
Looking at the structural fields, they included full legal names, postal addresses, dates of birth, national identification numbers, phone numbers, and email addresses.
Okay.
They also included telecom metadata and detailed KYC risk and verification logs. Because IDMerit is a California-based provider of AI-assisted identity verification utilized by regulated financial entities, these are comprehensive, highly structured identity portfolios.
Right. And you might be listening to this deep dive right now and thinking, well, my company doesn't use IDMerit, so our risk profile is unaffected. But that is missing the larger systemic threat vector entirely.
It absolutely is. Because attackers are utilizing this aggregated data to create synthetic identities that will bypass your own organization's KYC checks. When a threat actor acquires structured KYC datasets, they are fully equipped to execute long-term identity abuse across multiple jurisdictions.
Yes.
The strategic implication here crosses severe GDPR and financial regulation boundaries, and this specifically affects the United States, Mexico, the Philippines, and multiple European Union member states.
That is correct. The data classification falls under highly sensitive identity information because it combines static government identifiers with dynamic risk-scoring metadata.
Right.
It represents a substantial compliance failure for any organization reliant on that aggregator. This triggers mandatory reporting requirements across multiple global privacy regimes.
Absolutely. And because organizations are finally beginning to lock down those exposed cloud databases we just talked about, attackers are, predictably, changing their tactics.
The data reflects a clear shift, yes.
All right, they're not trying to brute force their way through the firewall anymore. They are simply logging in. So moving from accidental exposure to malicious intent, our secondary focus shifts to how legitimate access is being weaponized.
Which brings us to insider threats.
Exactly, insider threats and credential weaponization. The critical inquiry you must bring to your security leaders is this: how can our monitoring tools detect anomalous behavior when the attacker looks exactly like an authorized user on the network?
We have hard telemetry on two massive breaches driven entirely by this vector in Q1 2026. The first is Coupang, one of South Korea's largest e-commerce platforms.
Okay, let's look at Coupang.
The incident exposed approximately 33.6 to 33.7 million customer accounts. The root cause was definitively an insider threat.
An insider threat, okay.
Yes, a former engineer stole a signing key from the company's authentication system. This was then used to bypass normal access controls and scrape internal data at scale.
Wait, let's unpack the mechanics of that for a moment. If Coupang is a massive, tech-forward e-commerce giant, how does a single former engineer walk away with a core signing key?
It represents a severe failure in access revocation and cryptographic key management.
Right, because stealing an API signing key isn't just stealing a user password. It is the equivalent of spending heavily on a state-of-the-art security fence, only for an attacker to walk through the front gate using an employee's ID badge. Actually, it's worse.
Yes.
The attacker didn't just get access to one room. They gave themselves the ability to silently print valid keycards for every single room in the building, bypassing the front desk entirely. And to put that 33.7 million figure in a perspective for a localized market, that incident touches more than half of the South Korean population.
It does.
What was the exact nature of the data they scraped?
The exfiltrated data fields included names, mobile phone numbers, delivery addresses, and order histories.
Just standard e-commerce data so far.
Primarily, yes. However, notably, an internal delivery list page, which contained partially anonymized apartment entrance passwords alongside detailed logistical patterns, was accessed approximately 148 million times by the attacker using that compromised key.
Wow. That transitions the risk model from purely digital financial fraud to actual physical security concerns for the consumer.
It does elevate the risk profile considerably.
But analytically, I mean, if an internal endpoint is accessed 148 million times, why didn't their telemetry flag it? This points to a severe lack of internal rate limiting and anomalous behavior detection.
That is the primary structural failure here, yes.
Right. If your security operations center cannot detect 148 million API calls from a single source, your zero trust architecture is failing. So what was the second major credential-based incident?
SoundCloud. Operating globally but headquartered in Europe, they experienced a data leak impacting roughly 29.8 million user accounts. That represents about 20% of their platform.
And just to establish the baseline term here, credential abuse occurs when an unauthorized actor fraudulently uses a legitimate user's identification and password to access secure systems.
Yes, that is the exact mechanism. In this instance, attackers obtained valid credentials for an internal ancillary administrative tool.
Which highlights a classic architectural vulnerability that we see all the time.
Right.
Organizations will often enforce strict multi-factor authentication and rigorous security protocols on their primary production applications. But then, they leave legacy ancillary administrative tools running on outdated security frameworks.
Precisely. The group, later identified as shiny hunters, utilized this administrative access to enumerate user data at scale and attempt extortion.
What did the dataset actually contain?
The dataset contained around 30 million unique email addresses linked to SoundCloud profiles, alongside usernames, follower counts, and engagement metrics.
Okay, so no core financial data.
Right. Core passwords and payment details were not compromised. However, linking non-public email addresses to public profiles significantly increases those users' exposure to targeted spear phishing and specialized social engineering campaigns.
Which brings us directly to the third strategic vector. If the internal perimeter is secured, and access credentials are strictly managed and monitored, threat actors will logically pivot to the path of least resistance.
The supply chain.
Exactly, your organization's vendors and partners. The expanding supply chain and third-party risk is really the most significant blind spot for modern enterprise threat models right now.
The data from this quarter definitely supports that trend.
Board members frequently ask if their own systems are secure, but the real question is whether their vendor systems are secure. Risk cannot be outsourced. In the eyes of the consumer, the media, and the regulator, a vendor's breach is your breach.
We have clear citations demonstrating this expanding blast radius from early 2026. Odido, a major Dutch telecom provider, disclosed an incident affecting approximately 6.2 million customer accounts.
6.2 million.
Yes, which equates to about 1/3 of the entire Dutch population. The external intrusion occurred over the weekend of February 7th and targeted a customer contact or CRM environment.
Okay.
Official company statements and forensic telemetry suggest an external IT supplier was the initial point of compromise.
So it was a direct supply chain compromise. The attacker didn't breach Odido directly. They breached the IT supplier who had trusted access to Odido's CRM environment. What specific data was exfiltrated in that pipeline?
The exposed data potentially included full names, home addresses, mobile phone numbers, bank account numbers or IBAN dates of birth, and passport or driver's license numbers.
That is a massive compliance issue.
It is. Combining banking identifiers with government identification numbers substantially escalates the risk of fraudulent financial activity and regulatory penalties.
And again, for our baseline, third-party vendor risk is the likelihood that an organization will experience a cyber incident resulting from vulnerabilities within its external supply chain or service provider.
Exactly right.
And we saw this exact dynamic repeated, perhaps even more severely, in the North American healthcare sector with Navia Benefit Solutions.
Yes, we did. Navia is a United States-based third-party administrator managing tax-advantaged employee benefits like FSAs, HSAs, and COBRA. They detected a breach affecting roughly 2.7 million individuals.
2.7 million individuals, wow.
Right, and these individuals are connected to more than 10,000 employer clients who actively utilize Navia for benefits administration.
See, this is the fundamental structural mechanism of third-party risk right here. Those 2.7 million affected individuals likely have zero direct relationship with Navia. They probably don't even know who Navia is.
Most likely, no.
Their data was compromised purely because their employers contracted with this specific vendor to aggregate their health data. Third-party administrators are high-value targets because compromising just one vendor yields the data of 10,000 organizations.
Forensic analysis indicated the unauthorized actor maintained multi-week read and exfiltrate access, specifically from December 22, 2025 through January 15, 2026.
A multi-week dwell time.
Yes. The exposed data included Social Security numbers alongside detailed health plan and benefits enrollment details, implicating specialized regulatory protections around protected health information.
That multi-week dwell time is so critical to understand here. The attackers sat in that network from late December to mid-January. They didn't deploy ransomware immediately, which would have triggered an instant response.
Right, they were patient.
Exactly.
Oh.
They maintained low and slow read and exfiltrate access, slowly siphoning data over weeks to avoid triggering data loss prevention alerts. This proves that third-party vendor audits cannot just be a static annual checklist. They require continuous monitoring.
The data certainly underscores the need for continuous oversight.
Now, obviously, these mega breaches naturally capture the headlines, but we must also address the compounding threat of mid-sized exposures. This is the strategic "so what" that you need to convey to your leadership.
It is a critical component of the overall threat landscape.
It is, because attackers are currently chaining together smaller data sets to build massive composite profiles for targeted fraud or resale. The steady drumbeat of mid-sized compromises is quietly creating a composite risk profile that affects all enterprise threat models, regardless of your organization's size.
The clinical data illustrates this broader pattern precisely. We tracked an incident at Panera Bread in the United States where 5.1 million accounts were exposed after a failed extortion attempt.
Okay, that's one.
Then Crunchbase, a global B2B data platform, had 2 million records stolen via social engineering of staff or contractors. Figure, a U.S. fintech lender, saw 900,000 unique email addresses and borrower records exposed due to employee social engineering.
Right.
And UX, an Australia-linked fintech, reported unauthorized access impacting hundreds of thousands of borrowers and broker partners.
So notice the persistent, recurring mechanism in those mid-sized events. Social engineering. Attackers are manipulating human capital to bypass technical controls.
Yes, the human element remains a primary vulnerability.
You could deploy the most advanced zero-trust network access in the world, but if an attacker can socially engineer an employee with elevated privileges into handing over their multi-factor authentication token over a simple phone call, the technical controls are rendered entirely moot.
Exactly.
They extract these mid-sized batches of data and aggregate them into larger, illicit databases on the dark web, creating a massive ecosystem of compromised identities.
That is the ultimate goal for these threat actors.
So we have analyzed the vectors, the mechanisms, and the data. If you're building a deck for the board, here are 3 bullets to copy-paste. Bullet 1. Cloud infrastructure misconfigurations represent our highest volume risk vector, requiring automated continuous compliance monitoring.
A necessary baseline control.
Bullet 2. Insider threats and credential weaponization are successfully bypassing traditional perimeter defenses, necessitating zero-trust architecture. And Bullet 3. Third-party vendor compromises are exponentially expanding our attack surface, requiring rigorous vendor security auditing.
Those are the precise strategic takeaways from Q1.
But to ground those strategic directives, we really must examine the realities of incident response. Because the initial technical failure is very often compounded by severe operational mismanagement during the disclosure phase.
The Coupang breach provides the definitive cautionary tale for this quarter.
Walk us through the disclosure timeline on that one.
The caution lies not just in the stolen signing key, but in the catastrophic disclosure failure. When Coupang initially disclosed the security incident in November 2025, they reported that only a small number of customer accounts were affected.
A small number, right?
However, it took a joint investigation by South Korea's Ministry of Science and ICT to reveal in February 2026 that the true scope was actually 33.7 million users, which is over half the national population.
That's an unbelievable discrepancy.
The lesson for the C-suite is clear. Inaccurate initial scope assessments severely compound regulatory and reputational damage.
Absolutely. I mean, when a national government agency has to publicly correct your breach disclosure 3 months after the fact, the resulting loss of institutional trust is completely unquantifiable.
It changes the entire narrative of the incident.
It does. You move from being viewed as a victim of a cyber attack to being viewed as either incompetent or intentionally deceptive by regulators. Based on the Q1 2026 data we have analyzed today, the future outlook requires immediate strategic realignment.
The data leaves no room for complacency.
None at all. Security leaders must prepare for intensified regulatory scrutiny, specifically regarding GDPR, national privacy regimes, and mandatory reporting timelines. Furthermore, you must expect threat actors to continue exploiting the seams between your organization and your third-party vendors.
The supply chain will remain a primary target.
Exactly. The perimeter is no longer defined by your internal network firewalls. It extends to every external service provider, IT supplier, and cloud aggregator you integrate with.
That is the new reality of enterprise security.
It is. I leave you with this final analytical question to mull over as you review your own security posture. If a global identity aggregator managing billions of highly regulated KYC records can leave their front door entirely open on the public internet, how confident are you in the fundamental configuration audits of your own extended supply chain?
A critical question for every board this quarter.
Hit subscribe on YouTube at CyberByteFM and join the frequency for weekly intel. That is your briefing. Stay secure.